So in our fourth sample program for arrays, we're going to look at processing an array by doing a couple of common tasks. Specifically, what we're going to try to do in this program is we're going to try to determine what the lowest score in the array is, as well as the average. So like before, we're still dealing with student test grades, and I've initialized the array to some values hovering around 65% here. There's still 4 tests. And I don't, in this particular sample, I don't bother with the input loop. We're just going to use the grades as initialized. So in order to figure out the lowest score and the average score, I have a number of variables. So obviously lowest score to hold the lowest score in the array. To calculate the average, I have the intermediate step of summing up the scores. So I have a variable for that. Okay, and they of course match the data type of the array. Average score, which I'm using to hold the calculated average. And I've also put my counter for my processing and output loops as a separate variable with the scope of the program as well. And that just has to do with something I want to be able to show you. But at any rate, here is our processing loop. So I've done both bits of this processing in one loop. Okay, the loop itself is not a big surprise. It's the same as we've seen before, where we have a counter or an index starting at 0, going up to the tests, going up by 1 each time. Internally, the logic for figuring out the lowest score is looking at the current test score, and whether that's if that's less than what we have stored as the lowest score so far, then setting the lowest score to the current test score. And then also in the same loop, so I can get to my averages, just adding the current test score to the sum of the scores. Okay, so that loops for as many times as it loops, and at the end of it, what I'm doing is I'm calculating the average by taking the sum of the scores, which is a double already. I don't have to worry about typecasting or anything, and dividing it by, I've decided to divide it by the counter. Okay, so then my output loop, which we've seen before, where I'm just outputting the test grades. At the very last bit of output is displaying the lowest and average test score. Okay, so we'll run this program to make sure that it works okay. Okay, so we can see here it seems to output the array without any problems, and the lowest test score is 0 and the average test score is 52.1. Now I'm looking at these and I don't see any test scores that are less than 64, so clearly there's something wrong with my processing. So let's have a look. One of the first things I'm going to look at is the actual variable declarations themselves. And one of the things that I realize is that, oh, wait a second here, lowest score initially is not initialized. So it could be 0 or it could be garbage. If I'm going through this loop and I'm asking whether the current grade is less than the lowest score to start with, that's not guaranteed to happen. So one of the things that I'll fix right off the bat is setting the lowest score to an initial value that is obviously going to be too high, so it's out of the range of grades there. The sum of scores is an accumulator. It needs to start at 0 in order for it to make sense. I was just maybe getting lucky there, or maybe not. There may have been some garbage to start off with. So by changing those two, I'm probably a little bit closer. I'm not convinced that's going to solve my problem, but let's have a look. No effect whatsoever. At least I know that that solves some problems I wasn't having. However, I still have the problem that I saw before. So let's look a little bit at the actual logic here. Okay. So looking a little bit closer at this loop, I see that the test counter starts off at 0. The test counter, while the test counter is less than or equal to the number of tests, and this is where the problem is. So if I start off at 0 and I go up to and including 4, that actually means that I'm looping 5 times. Okay, so that's affecting how many times this is looping. So it's actually looping 1 extra time. It's looping for a position 4 that doesn't exist. In that position 4, there happened to be a 0, and that's why it was picking up 0 for the lowest score. It was overflowing the array. So you have to be very careful about sticking to the boundaries of the array. In some languages, like C Sharp, you can pick up on exception handlings for overflowing and underflowing arrays in certain circumstances. But in C++, you have to manage that yourself. So it's actually supposed to be less than the number of tests. Now, that had a couple of things. One, for the lowest score, it was picking up the 0. And the other reason was because it was the test counter coming out of it started off at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 was going in, incrementing the test counter to 5 before it stopped. So when I was dividing it by the test counter afterwards, it was actually dividing it by 5, which is why my average was off. So let's have a look at it now. Okay, so 64.8 is the lowest score. I can eyeball that and see that's true. And the average test score is 65.2. Just looking at those numbers, that seems very reasonable. So just to recap, this was about processing an array and some common errors that happen. You want to make sure that when you use a loop to process your array, you're not overflowing the array or going beyond the boundaries of the array. And then certainly, you know, a lot of just simple processing stuff, making sure your variables are initialized appropriately when required.